Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first live streaming event for History Unplugged. So I'm Scott Rank, and to the side of me, or the other side of you, depending on how it looks, is James Early.
Hey, so, howdy.
I think this might be the first time you're seeing us. I don't know what your expectations were. If you think that history lovers like to sit in libraries with leather-bound books and mahogany bookshelves with crystal decanters of scotch and a marble bust of Aristotle, which doesn't sound too bad. Yeah, I guess I missed out. James and I thought that we'd have Civil War hats, but we didn't think that far ahead. So James did get the Colt 45.
Yeah.
So basically we're here to answer any questions you have. Thank you for those of you who listened through the entire series on a history of the Civil War and 10 battles. A lot of you had follow-up questions, so we want to do our best to answer those that all of you voted on. And time permitting, we will get into some other things too. We want to keep things to about an hour. But the 6 questions that were voted on were, how many civilians died due to battles getting close to population centers? The second is, what was going on with John Wilkes Booth during the Civil War? Third, were people at the time aware of events like Harriet Tubman's involvement in the raid on Combahee Ferry? Fourth, and I really like this question, for various generals on both sides, was there a correlation with how well they did in West Point and how well they did on the battlefield? Fifth, more detail on POW camps. And the sixth one, which is the big hornet's nest that we're going to kick, is what do you think about the removal of the statues and renaming of places that have been named after Confederate soldiers? So without further ado, and also please feel free to type in any questions that you have for us in the text box. Can't promise we'll get to it. And if you could share the recording that you see on the Facebook page, if you can share that little box and like it and it gets some more people, we would appreciate that. But hey, let's just jump right in. So James, why don't you tell us how many civilians died due to battles getting close to population centers?
All right, there's a short answer and a long answer, and Scott and I are going to pretty much give you the short version in every case because we want to get as many questions in as we can. We don't want to spend too much time on one and then other questions not get answered. So let me try to give the short answer. Let me flip to my notes real quick. I can say the short answer is really not that many because most Civil War battles were not fought in urban areas. If you think about it, the overwhelming majority of the war was fought on Southern soil, and the South just didn't have a lot of large cities. So the South is primarily rural and agricultural. So there just weren't that many civilians around to be killed. Most of the battles occurred out in open places in rural areas like, for example, Chickamauga, Chattanooga. Chattanooga is a town, obviously, but the battle was outside of the town. It wasn't in the town. Even in situations like Atlanta, the city was largely evacuated. So by the time the Union Army got there, the civilians were mostly gone. Now, let's see. I do want to say that, like in Vicksburg, now that was a different situation, but Vicksburg wasn't really that big of a town. In Vicksburg, we don't know for sure how many people were killed, but probably about 12, just 12 were killed in Vicksburg, and about 60 were wounded. Of course, in Vicksburg, we talked about how the civilians burrowed into caves. They literally moved into caves to protect themselves, and so that helped as well. So, again, in summary, and by the way, Gettysburg, only one civilian was killed, just one. But again, Gettysburg was a tiny little town, and most of the battle did not take place in the town itself. It took place south and east of the town. Most civilian deaths were not caused by guns or cannons or anything like that. They were caused by starvation or by disease, because if you remember, there were a lot of refugees. A lot of civilians fled, as we already talked about, people evacuating cities. And these people often didn't have anywhere to go. And so they would end up malnourished. They'd die of starvation. And of course, disease was totally rampant in this time. We talked about how many soldiers died of disease. And a lot of people died simply because the man was off fighting in the war And the woman was trying to run the farm all by herself. Most people lived on farms. The kids helped out, but oftentimes it just wasn't enough. And so people just weren't able to grow food for themselves. And so they starved. So in summary, starvation and disease were a much bigger issue for civilians than actually being killed in combat.
Yeah, and if y'all want to look in my archives, I have an episode where somebody asked me about what was daily life like for a non-combatant in the Civil War. And like what James said, what it gets down to is if you're in the North, it's like World War II, where there's a big mobilization effort. People are doing charitable drives, but you don't see the ravages of war. In the South, it's like Russia during World War II, where you really see the ravages of war. But you can do that if you want to check out more there. All right. Well, that was very brief, very well done. I'll see if I can match that.
Yeah, I try to keep it short.
Yeah, and some of the other questions we'll dive into more. So the question for me was, what was going on with John Wilkes Booth during the Civil War? This is a fun question, and I talked to a book author who wrote a book. I think it's called "The Lady Killer Who Killed Lincoln," about John Wilkes Booth. And the point of the book is that he's an interesting figure because he assassinates a president, but he doesn't fit the profile of the typical person who threatens the life of a president. There's a book I came across called "Hunting the President" that looked into Secret Service archives. And the short of it is that the vast majority of people who threaten to kill a president or try to kill a president usually suffer from mental illness. They're typically failed upstarts in life. I mean, they might claim that they're killing the president for ideological reasons, whether they're a neo-Nazi or a far leftist or whatever. But a lot of times they're just failed upstarts and they want to make a name for themselves or impress Jodie Foster or whatever. But John Wilkes Booth is strange because he is not a failed upstart. He is the Ryan Gosling, George Clooney, whatever heartthrob you want. He is that of the 1850s and 1860s. He is an enormously popular actor. He was women pack the audiences wherever he played. He had many affairs. He had many paramours in different cities. Women would cram outside the stage door to catch a glimpse of him when he walked off. Very popular actor. So how does he get into all this? Why does he assassinate the president? So just a little bit about his plans to try to assassinate Lincoln. It seems that Booth was pro-Confederacy. He was opposed to abolitionism. But then the voltage really cranks up as the Civil War goes on. And why does that happen? Why would he throw away this life of success to go after Lincoln? So Booth was a Confederate, but his family were Marylanders, so they were divided, as James and I talked about. He was outspoken about his hatred of Lincoln, and he was overheard in 1863 in St. Louis saying that he wished the president would go to hell. So in 1864, Booth conspired along with some friends to kidnap Lincoln and deliver him to the South. Didn't work, but on March 17th, the group met in Washington to plan the abduction plot. But shortly after the war ended and the South surrendered, so they put together a conspiracy theory to go after, or they put together a conspiracy to go after Lincoln. And it was Booth knew Ford's Theater, so that's how he was able to get around. And it was terrible luck that Lincoln was shot because the president's bodyguard got bored with the play and left his post to get a beer, which shows you what security was like back then.
So awful.
Yeah, so I think we know the story about Booth shooting Lincoln, but why he shot him. One of the main theories, and the author of the book, The Lady Killer Who Killed Lincoln, thinks it was syphilis. What do I mean by that? Well, syphilis can cause it can cause expressions of mental illness, and there's reasons to believe that Booth might have had it. His popularity with the ladies could have definitely given him syphilis. It can lead to mental instability. So the theory, some people are skeptical about this theory that syphilis is what caused Booth to kill Lincoln. And it's only because it's only based on one symptom, which is Booth's hoarseness. But syphilis has many symptoms that vary depending on the stage of the disease. So when someone comes down with several of them, as Booth did, the likelihood of infection could be high. There's evidence that he had hoarseness, which he developed as an ongoing condition in 1864. He had tumors that he had removed from his back, the back of his neck in 1863. He had rashes. He had pain in his chest, which he complained to his friends. personality changes, which included illusions of grandeur and bouts of insanity and lack of restraint. So there you go. It very well could have been syphilis that caused him to be a killer. That's what was going on with John Wilkes Booth. All right. Next question is about Harriet Tubman. Were people aware of her involvements and her raiding, and did that affect public perception?
Yeah, let me give a little bit of background on this, because not everybody may be aware of this. It's not one of the most well-known and well-publicized incidents of the Civil War. We didn't talk about it, but I will talk a little bit about Harriet Tubman's involvement in the Combahee River raid, which is in southern South Carolina, southeastern South Carolina on the coast. So after the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect, which is January 1st, 1863, African Americans were allowed to enroll in the military. They were officially allowed. They were under scrutiny, and many people doubted about their commitment and their bravery. People were very racist, of course, and they said, well, they'll just run away, they won't fight, and so on. Tubman actually kind of became the head of a group of scouts in charge of espionage, and she was the commander. Like I said, she was in charge. So she didn't really command troops per se, like people that marched into regular battles, but she was the commander of a group of scouts. She reported directly to Generals David Hunter. Scott and I talked about General Hunter very briefly. He's also in the movie Glory, which I talked about a lot. And
take a shot as we did our contest. So.
Salud. But anyway, she was assigned to create lifelines and escape routes for trapped slaves. So on the night of June 2nd, 1863, this is just about a month before Gettysburg and about a month before the surrender of Vicksburg. But of course, this is several hundred miles away from that. So on June 2nd, 1863, Tubman guided a group of about 150 black soldiers of the 2nd South Carolina Battalion on the Combahee River. And the plan was to liberate as many slaves as they could by catching slaveholders by surprise. The attack became known as the Combahee River Raid, and it liberated more than 750 slaves. So that's pretty good. 150 people liberated another 750. Tubman's accomplishments in the Combahee River Raid stayed anonymous until July 10th of that year, 1863, when a journalist, Franklin B. Sanborn, published an article called Harriet Tubman. It was a biographical outline of Tubman's life. And Sanborn's article was published in the Commonwealth, which is an anti-slavery newspaper in Boston. He brought Tubman to the spotlight for the first time, praising her for guiding slaves to freedom using the Underground Railroad and by risking her life. So in summary, the answer was it was secret, but only for a few days. And then before long, it was widely known all around the North what Harriet Tubman was doing down in South Carolina to help out former slaves. That's it. That's all I got anyway. Yeah.
Well, all right. It gets right down to business. Very nice.
I have to explain. Can I explain my hat real quick to everybody?
Please, you've gotten positive comments. So.
Oh yeah. Thank you for all who like the hat. Yeah. I wasn't going to wear a hat at first, but I've just gotten too bald and I'm ashamed of it. Not because of syphilis, by the way, but at least I don't think so. My favorite baseball team is the Houston Astros. And before they were the Astros, they were the Colt 45s. Of course, right? Texas, everybody's got a gun. So the Colt 45 was the standard service revolver of the U.S. Army from 1872 to 1892. So a lot of Western movies you see, they've got 6-shooters. They've got Colt 45s. So
when you saw the hat, the first thing that came to my mind was the commercials with Billy D. Williams when he says Colt 45 goes down real smooth. So
Lando. Okay.
Anyway, but you know what? I would like to think that those two go together a lot, the drink and the firearm.
Yeah, they have, unfortunately, in our history, yes.
Yeah, so that's another thing there. But you have gotten comments there. And other people too. We can't promise it, but please feel free to comment away.
Yeah, we'd love to hear what you have to say. This is the closest thing to a Civil War hat I have. Believe it or not, I don't have a Civil War hat. I need to get one, but what can you do?
I guess do you rent the uniforms then for the reenactments? You don't have one in the closet?
Well, reenactors, they tend to gradually get their gear and they'll borrow what they don't have. When I did it, I actually bought the shoes and they were about $95, and this is 1990, so that wasn't cheap. They're handmade, and I bought a pair of the sky blue pants because most Confederates wore the same color pants as the Union did, believe it or not. And sometimes they literally stole them off of Union soldiers.